Hello, how are you doing? I'm so relieved that January is finally over. Does anyone else feel this way? I mean, January is always a bit of a downer, but this month has felt particularly bleak. I had a cold at the very beginning of the month and over New Year's, and it's been physically cold outside, of course, here in London. Also, it's been quite difficult to get around London even because there's been continuous transport strikes, so half the time it's quite tricky to even get anywhere. I've also been very broke this month, and so I've been trying to escape all of this by just staying in and reading quite a lot. So I've read lots of books over this month, and thank goodness for books. I don't know how I would have got through the month without them. And so I'm going to go through and talk about all the books I've read. But I'd love to know if you've read any of these books, or if you're interested in reading any of these books now, or other books that you've read this month that you've found a joy and escape from the realities of the darker aspects of the month. So starting off, I started off with quite a fun book, or that I want to start off talking about quite a fun book, which also has a serious side, which is really good actually, by Monica Heisey. So in this novel, we're following a character named Maggie, who is just approaching 30 years old, and she is starting to get a divorce from her husband, who she's been in a relationship with him for a long time, but they haven't actually been married all that long, and there wasn't any big, huge thing which caused this breakup, but it was just a gradual disintegration of their relationship. So she's trying to get her life together at this point when it feels like, or at least she feels like there's this concept that things should be falling into place at this time in your life when you're almost 30 years old, and there's this conception that you should have, a steady job by this point, you should have settled down, you should be starting a family and have a home. She doesn't really have any of these things. She has to leave the place where she's been living with her husband. She has a job at a teaching, and she's also working on a PhD, but she's not all that invested in either of those things. And and there's the breakdown of her relationship, which initially she thinks, oh, this is an opportunity to move on, to meet other people, and you see a lot of this awkward and relatable humor as she tries to bring her life together, and in this kind of Bridget Jones way, she kind of sets goals for herself, which quickly she falls out of the habit of, or reverts back to old bad habits of hers. So this is a very good January book, because a lot of people make resolutions at New Year's, which quickly get forgotten or start to seem unrealistic, and it does have this humorous edge to it of this kind of biting self-deprecatory humor. And the writer Monica Heisey, she's written a lot for television, including the TV show Schitt's Creek. If you've ever watched that, it does contain a lot of that kind of humor, which is really amusing. I wouldn't say I ever necessarily laughed out loud while reading this, but I certainly chuckled a lot in appreciation while reading a lot of this. It's also quite cleverly structured in that it's mostly a straightforward account of her life from her perspective, but you get these kind of outsider views on her life when you see their lists, or there are Google searches that she does, and or their text messages exchanges through dating apps or through other people. So you can see a list of Google searches, and this kind of reveals more about her state of mind than what she does so upfront in what she's like telling us and revealing to us. It shows that she's kind of more unbalanced than than initially appears in this kind of response that she gives to people if she's asked how she is, and she's like, oh, really good actually, but we know that she's really doesn't have it all together, and she becomes increasingly unhinged towards the end of the book, and we start to see through the perspectives of other people who are speaking to her or through their actions and the way that they're relating to her, that really she's gone off the rails, and this is effective up into a point, but I did feel like the novel was slightly overlong, and I started to really dislike her over the course of the book. And I know that you're kind of meant to, and in a way, but be drawn into her as someone who is striving to make her life better, but is often failing at it, and or failing in ways that society sort of expects you to succeed, and so sort of learning to overcome those conceptions and to love herself in a better way. And I feel like the novel is fairly good at getting at that, but yeah, it does lose it a bit along the way, and it gets to a point where her actions seem so outlandish that it starts to feel a bit unrealistic that someone would have so little sense of self-awareness that they would be doing such crazy things and not realize that people won't react positively to this. And so that did start to feel slightly unrealistic. In a way that was somewhat similar. I kind of made this connection between the novel Eleanor Oliphant is completely fine if you've read that novel, the way that the humor starts to it feels like the author feels this need to increase and amplify the humor to the point that it's at the expense of their character. That's how I felt with Eleanor Oliphant, and I think that happens somewhat in this novel, not to such a degree as in Eleanor Oliphant, but yeah, it does kind of unfortunately happen in this novel. But at the same time, there are so many funny passages in this that overall it was really enjoyable to read. There's a particularly good awkward threesome scene where she feels like, oh yeah, I want to have this threesome. She's a bit drunk at a wedding, and so she's going to be outlandish, but it just ends up being so cringeworthy, and I always think that makes for really great humor. So yeah, there's a lot to enjoy in this book, but overall, I didn't think it was completely successful. I also read Ghost Music by Anne Yu. I bought this in Waterstone sale. I just was really intrigued by the cover and the sound of it. The central character and whose point of view we get is a woman named Son Yan, who's a gifted pianist. She gives lessons in piano to children, and she's caught between two different perspectives. She has her husband who doesn't want to have children, and there is her stepmother who also lives with her and her husband, who really wants them to have children. She also wants to have children, but her husband is so adamant that he doesn't, that she doesn't have much choice, and so she's really caught in this place between them, and this novel veers between realism and the more surreal. She starts to have dreams about these glowing, talking mushrooms, and then that seems to intrude upon her actual reality. And there are also these scenes where she goes to visit a man who was a child prodigy and one of the most talented pianists in the country, but he suddenly disappeared one day. Her father really admired him, but she strikes up this odd connection with him and finds him and discovers him kind of living, or at least existing. It's not entirely sure whether he's still living in this old structure, and so she goes to see him and plays the piano for him, and his hands kind of hover over her hands as she's playing, and it's like she's gradually striking out to form this independence from this life she's found herself in. In some ways, this man who is a child prodigy is kind of the opposite to her experience. She gave up her opportunity to become a classical musician professionally in order to have a family and to teach children. And whereas he abandoned his life and musical career for this other very shadowed existence, and so I like that pairing in the novel, and also how it explores the difference between solitude and loneliness. There's one really meaningful passage where she describes solitude as this very nurturing state of being, but when it tips over into loneliness, it's this sense of isolation that can actually kill you. And so it's like she's trying to strive for a new life in which she can have this kind of independence and this sense of very secure and self-affirming solitude, but she doesn't quite know how to get there. So we follow her through this odd journey, and I feel like it could have been developed somewhat more. It all becomes slightly too vague, or at least I wish there was some more concrete details, or some aspects of the story had been followed through more so that we understood them. But is a really interesting journey following her, and I loved the representation of her love of music, and how she really comes alive when she expresses herself through music. So it's like how we need to find something in our lives which we can be really passionate about, and that really carries us through our days. Now, I already talked about this short novel, Vista, Chinesa, by Tatiana, Salem, Levy in a previous video, but I just wanted to mention it more because I think it is such a striking and powerful book, and I think it's so unique how the author chose to form this narrative and create this character based on a friend of hers who had this horrible experience of being raped, and how this has affected her throughout her life. And so she chose to represent this in a character who is writing letters to her children. And I think that's such a unique way of approaching it, and really a risky way of looking at it, because it's quite a bold thing for someone to be writing letters to their children confessing such a horrific thing that happened to them, because I think quite often parents try to hide aspects of themselves when they have had experiences in the past which have been very damaging. I think naturally they almost want to protect their children from that experience, so to be so upfront about it and is quite a statement to make, but also I think it's showing how she herself is trying to work through some of these issues and these memories, and to try to reconcile with this past, which so many people in her life have told her she should just get over, that she should move on from, or that they can say how, oh, it's good that you've since been married, that you've had children, that you have a family, and you're continuing with your job. You've been able to live through this experience. In a lot of ways, she feels like she hasn't lived through it. It's still so present with her and so much in her life, and that people tell her that it's good she's moved on with her life, when she knows that hasn't been in the case. And in some ways she's continuing to live and move on, but it's still so much with her. And so the trauma of this experience, and the way that this novel describes that, moving backwards and forwards in time and through this narrative. Sometimes the sentences kind of run on as she's trying to recount and capture her experience and all the complexity of the emotions that she's feeling. It's so powerfully done and really striking, and given me such insight into the experience of someone who has experienced a sexual assault and trauma in this way and continuing on with it, and how the novel shows this both on like a larger level through how this is received in the community and in the nation in general, and how victims of rape are treated after an attack. And so yeah, it gives a lot of insight into these things, and so I appreciate this novel so much. Now, it's quite striking going from that novel and representation of someone who is the victim of a sexual assault to a perpetrator or a potential perpetrator, and showing that point of view in Vladimir by Julia May Jonas. This is a debut novel, and it's narrated from the point of view of a 50-something literature professor at a small college. And in the very beginning of the novel, in the preface, she describes how a man named Vladimir is unconscious and she's chained him to a chair. And so we're immediately wondering what is going on in this situation. And she's discussing things very casually. She almost just like mentions that this has happened, and then almost wistfully goes on about how she imagines situations from just seeing the initials of individuals, and so builds up this kind of fantasy around it. And so you feel like this woman is at a very dodgy place, and but then you get the backstory of her life and where she is. So she is teaching at this college, and her husband is also a teacher there, and he has been accused of misconduct with students over a number of decades. So a number of students from his past have come forward and said that he had inappropriate relations with them. And she kind of defends this because she says that they had an open marriage and all these relationships he had with his students were consensual. She also had a number of extramarital affairs over the decades. And you feel, or you see how through some people's point of view, from her colleagues and the students at the college, some see her as a victim of a husband who has been philandering and cheating on her over many years, and then others see her as his accomplice, that she's been allowing this to happen. She's known it's been going on and hasn't spoken up and said anything, and it is so entrenched in her point of view, and she's very highly educated, very convincing in her opinion, so you see the logic of her perspective. And it's a really interesting way of looking at all these issues to do with desire and consent and the power play in relationships, especially amongst individuals between different generations, or when there are wide age gaps between people. And throughout all of this, there is a visiting professor, Vladimir, who is 40, who has a very successful debut novel, or at least critically successful debut novel, and who is also physically extremely handsome, and she becomes somewhat infatuated with him. And so we follow this progression in their connection, relationship with each other, their friendship, which progressively builds into something else as her fantasies break into reality. And so it's quite suspenseful in that way, while also talking about all these larger, meaningful issues from a really unique point of view. And we also get the points of view of her husband and her adult daughter on these issues. And I really like how at the very end of the novel, actually, it shifts the focus. So you then suddenly get an entirely different perspective from this very convincing, very educated perspective that we've been so entrenched in over the course of the novel. So yeah, I think there's a lot of tantalizing detail in this book. It's a very juicy story that yields a lot of pleasure as well as insight. Now, I know I made a whole video about solitary life and how that's represented in some novels, the striving towards independence from the life you've been born into or that you've built around yourself over time to live on your own. And I've found this in a number of books that I've read over the course of this month. So I want to talk about these books, especially in that context. I mean, I've already discussed this new novel, Sugar Street by Jonathan Dee, which is, again, like Vladimir, is told through the point of view of an unnamed narrator. And in this novel, he's concealing his identity because he's sort of on the run in a way, but from his past life, not necessarily from any crime he's committed, but he's completely abandoned his life and he's gone through great lengths to cover his tracks, to be completely anonymous and live anonymously. So at the start of the novel, he's driving in a car. He has a bundle of money in the back, and he goes through a number of stages to arrive at this small town where he rents a part of an apartment, which is quite dingy, with cash from a quite dodgy woman, and stays in this small community and tries to live completely anonymously and have as little contact with other people as possible, and to avoid detection, avoid being caught on any cameras, and so we're constantly wondering why this is, and we get some. He kind of misdirects us a number of times. He drops in little hints about his past, which aren't actually true, because he's trying to cover his tracks. But you do find out towards the end what actually happened in his past, what he left behind, and something I didn't talk about in that video, which I really meant to, was in talking about this quest for independence, is the how we can be so motivated to do this because we want to have autonomy, we want to live as fulfilling a life as possible, but in doing so sometimes, or at least making such a radical break from our ordinary lives, we can really hurt the people that we are connected to in our lives. So somebody that just walks away from their life and might leave a partner or family behind, or friends, that this could be really damaging to those people. And so I think we're constantly weighing up the trying this balance in life of trying to live in a way which is fulfilling to ourselves, but which is also nurturing and supportive to the people around us. And this novel is almost strictly concerned with the individual. This man who is really just fed up with the culture around him, and so wants to live as good a life as possible, but he quickly finds that that's not really so possible when you start to form other connections with people in the community and people you meet. You're immediately introduced to complications, and you're living in a larger community in a country which has issues going on around it, and you have to engage with those on some level, or you're not really living. And so it's raising all those questions, and I think it does so in an interesting way, but that it does give a kind of limited point of view on all of these issues. And so next I want to talk about a novel that I really enjoyed, and an author that I touched upon in that video I made about solitary living, because Anne Tyler's novel Ladder of Years is one of my favorite books of all time, and is a really interesting book in that it's a woman who has walked away from her life, who just wants to read all of the time, so tries to go to live in solitude for quite a while. And in this latest novel of Anne Tyler's, French Braid, it represents a family over a number of decades, and the novel begins in 2010 with a woman who has just started this relationship, and she remarks to the man she's seen that her family isn't really so close anymore, and so they're at a train station. She sees a man who she thinks is her cousin, but she's not entirely sure because her family doesn't meet all that often. And then she goes back through the decades to this family's early life, when a couple have 3 children, and they go off on this family holiday in the 1960s, I think it is, and then it moves forward through time in subsequent decades, and you see the perspectives of, or focuses on the perspectives of different members of this family. So you see how this family is gradually branched out over time and become less and less connected as they're pursuing their lives as individuals, but still maintain these loose family connections. And I think one of the most interesting perspectives and points of view is a character named Mercy, who's the mother of the family, but she's not a matriarch in the traditional or conventional or stereotypical sense of a matriarch. She doesn't like cooking all that much. She's very loving and supportive and nurturing to her children and to her husband and keeping her family together. But really, she is an artist and she wants to pursue her interest in art. And so she gets to a point when all of her children have become adults and left the family home that she wants to embark on her life as an artist, and she gets a studio, and she gradually moves into this studio and out of the family home. So she, in a sense, has left her husband, but she's still with him. She still sees him regularly, and but she's just kind of created this independent life for herself, which I think is a really interesting, almost solution to this query that Anne Tyler seems to have been looking at through a number of different novels and different ways, of some people that have made this abrupt break with their lives, and then others who have chosen to stay, and the compromises they have to make in their personal happiness by staying in circumstances which slightly impinge upon their liberty to be able to, pursue the things that might make them most happy. And so it's almost this really interesting solution where the character of Mercy almost has it both ways, or she's found this compromise in order to live the life that she really wants to have. But I think it's also worth noting Anne Tyler looks at the points of view of many different family members in a really interesting and dynamic and sympathetic way. The way she looks at their lives, like the father of the family, he could be seen as a stereotypically domineering patriarch. He has his expectations on masculinity for his son, which his son doesn't naturally feel, and so this creates a rift between the son and the other members of the family, which doesn't really heal over time, and they still stay connected, but he kind of keeps them at a distance over time as he meets a woman and marries her without even telling his family until after the fact. And so yeah, it's really interesting how it explores these very different points of view over time. So yeah, I really enjoyed this novel. I just love Anne Tyler's writing. I think she gives such an interesting perspective, and I think it's so great. A few years ago, I think she publicly announced that she had written her last novel, but she's continued to publish a few novels since then, so she clearly hasn't stopped. She's continued going, which is wonderful. Now, also in the novel The New Life by Tom Crewe, which I made a whole video about, so I'll only talk about it briefly, but specifically about this idea of trying to form an independent existence, but the sometimes damage that can cause to other people in your life. So here you have two different men in the Victorian era in London who are real social thinkers and philosophers. They publish essays and these thoughtful pieces. One of them is gay and has been married for many years, and he meets a man and starts having an affair with him, and he's had affairs with a number of men over the years, but he's decided he's got to a point in his life where he just wants to pursue this relationship and not maintain the facade as he has been doing with his wife, and so he makes that conscious choice, and it's really interesting how, though it flips between his perspective and this other man's perspective, you also get her point of view of the wife who has been left behind in some ways, and the damage this causes to her life because he's made this choice. And so there's this big conflict in the story, because obviously you want him to have his happiness after making these compromises in his life because of the conditions of the society, but at the same time, this has really impacted her. I like how he shows this rounded point of view, but also from the point of view of the other man that he has met, and they collaborate on this project of writing this book, which tries to show more progressively how there are sexual attitudes outside of the constrictions of the Victorian society, specifically by taking testimonies by a number of gay men that practice homosexual relationships and affairs and sex, but who aren't able to speak about it openly because it's against the law. And it's also really interesting, this novel, how the trial of Oscar Wilde is going on in the background. And I've read about the Oscar Wilde's trials a number of times, but it's mostly focusing on his point of view, and it's so interesting how this novel opens up how this affected other queer people in the community and society at the time, because there were reverberations and consequences of the Oscar Wilde trial that was going on and so widely publicized that caused difficulties for other queer people living in the community. And so, yeah, I think that's such an interesting point of view and really made me think about this time period in such a different way. But also, Tom Crewe's writing is so atmospheric, and he really brings this era alive in all of its details. And there's also so much about this novel that's really sensual and sexy, and so it's really engaging to read this story. And I think as a debut novel, it's so impressive, and obviously can be likened to the work of Alan Hollinghurst or Henry James, and in the way he portrays the psychological detail of these situations and through these scenes, it's so well done. And also, summing up this theme of working towards an independent life, there's probably the most famous recent example of that with the figure of Prince Harry and how he's published his memoir called Spare, because he's seen as the spare of the family, the second son. In case something happens to the first son, he's almost like the insurance policy for the royalty. And he explores this idea of spare in a number of different ways throughout the book. Now, I know so many people come to this memoir with a lot of preconceptions and have probably already made up their mind how they feel about Prince Harry and the whole situation of the royals before reading it. And we've certainly got so much information about it through interviews, and there was the whole Netflix series, which actually I didn't watch, with Harry and Meghan. But so some of this information was new to me. I'm reading this memoir, and it also includes some things which he hasn't revealed before, and I did talk about that in a whole video. But yeah, I think it's obviously, yeah, a very interesting and public example of someone who was born into a situation which he didn't ask to be born into, but has gained independence from it now, or somewhat of independence from it, which actually you find out in this book he didn't really choose for himself. When he and Meghan were having so many issues and he went to the palace to discuss these things, it was almost pre-decided, or at least as Harry presents it, it was decided, because they a number of options are presented, but then there's really one option which has pretty much already been planned for them, not necessarily by his family, but by the people that were surrounding the Queen at the time. And so it's quite startling accusations he makes about this sense of scheming that has gone on to sort of direct what will happen and in his status as not being a royal anymore. And yeah, and I can totally understand that a lot of people just aren't interested in this. I mean, I have a limited interest in the royal family. I've never been all that engaged by news about them or been all that interested in it. And I also fully realize that some other people have very strong opinions on one side or the other about all of this. And overall, I just think it's quite like a sad state of affairs. I have to wonder, and I think a lot of people are wondering, like, well, where can he go on from this? And I think you do see his real dilemma in this, because really the only professional training he's had in his life is with the military, and he's not been able to continue a military career because of the safety risk, because he will be a target to the enemy as such like a valuable person to capture and to ransom. And so this poses a danger to himself, but also the people that he works with in the military and the people immediately around him who might become targets as well. So yeah, now he's at a place where he acknowledges that it's kind of ridiculous, but he hasn't been trained for anything else. So I can't really blame him for taking these deals and because in order to have the money to protect his family, because they require security because they are so hemmed in by the media. And so it is understandable in a way, but I also wonder like, well, where can he really go from here? And apparently this is the first book in a 4-book deal. So, but what more does he have to reveal, or does he feel like he's had to keep some things back in order to still confess some things in some future books in order to make people want to buy them? And so it's a big dilemma. It's a whole mess, and the whole thing is just really sad. And finally, I've been reading Bret Easton Ellis, and I made a whole video about how I feel about his new novel, The Shards, but I did find it really interesting reading Less Than Zero, and I had read Bret Easton Ellis before. I had read American Psycho and Lunar Park, which actually somebody commented in the video about the Shards that I made that they felt Lunar Park was one of his most successful books and most mature books, because he gets emotional in that book, and you see his emotion with his lost connection with his family in a way that I don't think you do in the other books. And so in some ways the Shards feels almost like a reversion back to a lot of the themes and ideas that he was exploring in Less Than Zero, but in a much more dramatic way, in a way that is more self-consciously like a thriller or a suspense novel. And like I said in that video, I think it is effective on that level as a suspense book. It's very atmospheric, and I did really get into the story and was creeped out by some sections of it. But as a kind of social commentary in the way that I feel like we got in Less Than Zero, his debut novel, it wasn't as entirely successful, or at least it was just like treading the same themes and ideas that he had first explored in this book, which did feel quite revolutionary at the time. And I do appreciate the books as kind of time capsules of this bygone era, because there are so many cultural references from the time that he makes throughout the books, which I did appreciate, but that means I only sort of enjoyed them on like an aesthetic level rather than feeling really connected with them. And I do appreciate that he's giving a different kind of point of view than we get in a lot of other books, but at the same time, I feel like there's only so much you can say, and it's quite limited in what it can do. And I understand why some readers are really put off by him as such, because he is representing this point of view of like nihilism, that life doesn't really have any meaning, or at least it does for this set of people that have grown up in this particular set of circumstances. And so it's I mean, I can't really get that emotionally invested in any of his characters. And I probably enjoyed and appreciated Less Than Zero more than I did the Shards, but this was more a gripping read on a thriller level. So there's that. And but I probably won't be reading Bret Easton Ellis anytime again soon. But it was interesting to explore that. So those are all the books I read over the month of January. Yeah, I really immersed myself in a lot of different books, and I'm looking, there's a lot more that I'm looking forward to getting to. But I'd love to know if you have any thoughts or feelings about any of these books, if you've read them, or if you're interested in reading them now, or if you want to discuss any other books that you've read over the past month that you thought were particularly striking or interesting and want to discuss and recommend to me. I'd love to hear about that in the comments below. I've just knocked the video. But I hope you're doing well and reading good things, and I'll speak to you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.